Howdy. So today we're back in Ezra, and we are going to finish that fourth chapter that we started a couple of weeks ago. Specifically, we will cover verses 6 to verse 24. And just as a precursor, as an introduction to what we will cover, be ready because this is very informational. And that's keyword for boring. And some of you are like, you're always boring. And my response to that is there are layers and levels to boring. This is like next level boring. But here we don't skip over boring. We don't fast forward boring. We don't try to manipulate and distort boring. We welcome boring. Like, we open doors to boring. We cheer on boring. Why? Why do we do this? Why do we not skip over quote unquote boring portions of Scripture? It is God's Word, but if you just compare it to life, if you had a choice, let's say, God came to you and told you, hey, you're going to live X amount of years. You have a choice. You can live it all out and enjoy and take advantage and deal with your life as a whole, or we can just skip over all of the boring part. We can fast forward through the boring part. How many years would you actually live? 10, 20 tops, right? Life, existence is made up of this. We have to learn how to deal with it. We have to, again, learn how to enjoy it and find meaning from boring. So here we have a great opportunity to do that. And trust me, there are levels to this, and this is one of those high-ranking, high-level, boring portions of Scripture. But, hopefully towards the end, we do also get a little bit of devotional content as well. Like I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, up until this point, we've had a pretty good chronology of events. One thing happening after the other, after the other, after the other. But now on chapter 4, the author switches from a pure chronology to more of a topic, a thematic portion of Ezra. And here his concern is to talk about all of the resistance that God's people faced as they were trying to rebuild their community, namely the temple and their society, their religious system, eventually, the walls, so on and so forth. Instead of continuing the chronology and talking about a little resistance that they faced at one point, and then continuing the story, and then eventually talking about another portion of resistance, and then he got all of the times of major resistance and compiled them into this chapter. Okay? So this is what we are covering. We already started with this in the first 5 verses that we covered on chapter 4, and that followed the chronology. But then once we reach now verse 6, it's going to start skipping over time. And then eventually more, and then by the end, it's going to actually rewind to go back to the chronology that we left off on verse 5. I did a little graph. Eventually we'll get to it so you can visually understand what I just said. But for now, let's go ahead and read and cover this as a whole. So starting from chapter 4, verse 6, and it says, in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. In the days of Artaxerxes, also Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabal, and the rest of their companions wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and the letters were written in Aramaic script and translated into the Aramaic language. Rehum, the commander, and Shimshai, the scribe, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to King Artaxerxes in this fashion. From Rehum, the commander, Shimshai, the scribe, and the rest of the companions, representatives of the Danites, the Ephasarla, the Tarpolites, the people of Persia, and Erech and Babylon, and Shushan, and the Havites, and Elamites, and the rest of the nations, whom the great and noble Osnapper took captive and settled in the cities of Samaria, and the remainder beyond the river, and so forth. Verse 11. This is a copy of the letter that they sent him. To King Artaxerxes, from your servant, the men of the region beyond the river, and so forth. Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem and are building the rebellious and evil city, and are finishing its walls and repairing the foundations. Let it now be known to the king that if this city is built and the walls completed, they will not pay tax, tribute, or custom, and the king's treasury will be diminished. Now, because we received support from the palace, and it was not proper for us to see the king's dishonor, therefore we have sent and informed the king that search may be made in the book of the records of your fathers, and you will find it in the book of the records, and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces, and that they have incited sedition within the city in former times, for which cause this city was destroyed. We informed the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, the result will be that you will have no dominion beyond the river. The king sent an answer to Rehum, the commander, to Shimshai the scribe, to the rest of their companions who dwell in Samaria, and to the remainder beyond the river, peace, and so forth. The letter which you sent to us has been clearly read before me, and I gave the command, and a search has been made, and it was found that this city, in former times has revolted against kings, and rebellion and sedition have been fostered in it. There have also been mighty kings over Jerusalem who have ruled over all the region beyond the river, and tax, tribute, and customs were paid to them. Now give the command to make these men cease, that this city may not be built until the command is given by me. Take heed now that you do not fail to do this. Why should damage increase to hurt of the kings? Now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum, Shimshai the scribe, and their companions, they went in haste to Jerusalem against the Jews, and by force of arms made them cease. Thus the work of the house of God which is at Jerusalem ceased, and it was discontinued until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. There's a little illustration graph here, if you will, and basically this is what we have already in the first 5 verses of chapter 4, and now are continuing to cover from verse 6 to verse 24. On the first 5 verses, again, it was just continuing the chronology that we were experiencing since, verse 1, chapter 1, and it ended right when the people of the land who were living there prior to these exiles coming back, they overheard the ruckus, right? They heard the noises. In the prior chapter, we saw them worshiping God, singing, praising. Some people were crying, some people were happy. But again, it was obvious that they were doing something, and because of that, the peoples that were already living there, they took notice. And they went there and basically offered to help the leaders of the children of Israel, the people's God. They denied, they refused to accept this help. And right after that refusal, then it became very evident that those who were trying to help, they actually wanted to hinder. So they showed their true colors. And now after verse 5, as I mentioned, we have several other episodes throughout history that a similar thing occurred. So basically from verse 7 to verse 23, within the reign of this next king, Artaxerxes, actually prior to that on verse 6, with King Xerxes, it jumps 50 years. And there's just one mention of this king, and just briefly stating that some of these things were happening, but it doesn't go into great detail. And then again, the next section from verse 7 to verse 23 is the section that we have a lot more content, and that jumped another 70 years. And then by the time we get to verse 24, it actually rewinds 55 years to where we were more or less where we were on verse 5. Okay, so it's going back and forth more or less, or actually forth, and then back, if you will. So let's cover this in a little bit greater detail, and then again by the end we can sort of sum it all up and hopefully glean a particular lesson based on this very informational text, right? So on verse 6, again, as I just stated, it is just a mention of this next king that during his reign, these peoples came to him, or because of, the circumstances that were apparent at that particular time, there were certain challenges that were made of this rebuilding process. Again, in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. And that portion just stops right there. We don't have any details. We don't know exactly what happened as fruit of that particular letter, or what particular accusations were raised. We can guess and estimate that it was basically the same stuff that they've been saying over and over again. And to a certain degree, it worked, where the enemies of God's people were able to manipulate those who were in a position of authority, namely the kings of different periods of time, to question whether or not these returning exiles should continue to rebuild their society. So then we move forward in time, and now we have another king reigning. And this is the portion of chapter 7 that we have most content and more detail provided for us. An interesting portion of, or an interesting item that is included in this portion has to do with linguistics. Let me read to you again from the second part of verse 7 and on. And it says, "And the letter was written in Aramaic script and translated into the Aramaic language." So what we have in Ezra, and we only have this in one other book of the Bible, where we have multiple languages being utilized. From the beginning of the book till chapter 4, verse 7, everything was Hebrew. Now from chapter 4, verse 8, now everything is going to be Aramaic until the end of chapter 6. Then we have a portion that it goes back to Hebrew, and then we have once again another portion in Aramaic. And the reason for that is the documentation of what occurred in these exchanges between the enemies of God's people and these kings, they were written in this official language. And basically the person who was compiling this information, instead of translating, they essentially copied and pasted. Much like students do when they do essays before AI. Now, it's a little bit more deliberate cheating before you try to, do a little bit of, again, creative writing, if you will, by borrowing other people's thoughts. And now you're not even thinking anymore. The robot or the AI is doing all the thinking for you. But once again, it was just copy and paste. Everything that was happening, everything that was documented in this legal, official language, which is interesting. Why is this interesting? It's interesting because, as we know, regardless of what language was being utilized and for what purpose, we know that ultimately the reason why we have access to this information is because God was organizing and orchestrating everything that was occurring. Even the things that were more bureaucratic in nature, even the things that were more legal, if you will, even the things that were more political, and that applies till this day. Oftentimes we think that God reigns over the religious portion of society and history. And all the other parts of society that are more historical, more bureaucratic, more legal, less spiritual in nature, God just allows history to unfold, and then eventually he intervenes to make it more spiritual in nature, and then he pauses or steps back once again and then allows humanity to take over in their own way. Baloney. In every aspect of human history, whether it seems like a little bit more spiritual or not, God is the one that is orchestrating. God is the one that is managing. God is the one that is controlling all aspects of our existence. And this, once again, is a great example of that. Even the exchanges, these legal, bureaucratic exchanges, in their own language, from the enemies of God's people to these kings that were ruling, even that was done so for the purposes of God in this period of time in human history. And again, that applies till this day. So we move forward. So from verse 7 to verse 10, the king that is in charge is this king Artaxerxes. And the interesting thing about this portion is, again, it's a lot more detailed, and there's a lot more information that we have. And the first part, which, fumbling around with all these hard names, but there was an effort being made here to name drop. There was a deliberate effort from not only the enemies, not only from these officials, but also from God's perspective and from the people of God's perspective, to know who was doing what. And in verse 7 to verse 10, it's just an introduction to who was trying to go against the people of God. And if you try to decipher a little bit who is included here, and I'm not going to reread this because, again, I've butchered it already, and I'm not going to try it again. But the interesting thing is that these people came from different places. They had different ethnicities and cultures. So it wasn't just one group of people going against God's people. Basically, it was all of these different groupings of people that had different cultural backgrounds, different ethnicities, located in somewhat different areas. They came to an accord, they came to an agreement. Apart from what they were trying to do, they actually had some animosity between them. But now they had found common ground. And what was the common ground? What united them? What was the glue that brought them together? The glue that brought them together was to go against God and God's people. This says something about the world. This says something about how the world functions. Oftentimes, again, there are different realms and aspects and groupings of the world. And one thing may not even seem remotely related to another. But oftentimes, when there is common ground and when there is commonality, it's because it is all against God and God's people. That has occurred since the beginning and will continue to do so. So do not be surprised. Do not be surprised when it happens, as it happens, and know for a fact that it will continue to happen. It is the common ground. It is the glue that unites all different aspects of the world. Animosity against God and God's people. So after, again, this list of hard names of people from different backgrounds, but again, they were united in this cause, we have the content of the actual letter from verse 11 to verse 16. And I want to read this portion again because we get a little bit of insight into how they wanted to manipulate, or at the very least, how they wanted to present their arguments and their claims against God's people. And it says here from verse 11 to verse 16, to King Artaxerxes, from your servants, the men of the region beyond the river, and so forth, let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem, so far so good, and are building the rebellious and evil city, and are finishing its walls, and are repairing the foundations. Now, here is a note of the walls, but as already stated, we're moving around time. So this portion is actually parallel to the time of Nehemiah. But again, the author is just compiling all of this persecution and all of this times of resistance. But the topics and the claims, they were sort of similar in all of these periods of times that the people of God experience these types of oppositions. And it continues by saying, let it be known to the king that if this city is built, the walls completed, they will not pay tax, tribute, or custom, and the king's treasury will be diminished. So they pointed to and they speculated that if the people of God were able to be successful in rebuilding their community, it would hurt the king's pocket. In some way, shape, or form, it would be financially detrimental to him and his kingdom if they allowed them to succeed. Which is a great strategy, wouldn't you agree? Anytime you make these types of claims that something will hurt, something will hinder, something will get in the way of finances, people usually get worried, especially kings who have money, And as you know, more money, more problems. No money, no problems. But when you have a lot of money, you have a lot to worry about. So even if the accusation was frivolous, it was still a concern. Because for a king, he would rather err on the side of caution and say, okay, if this is a remote possibility, then let's pump the brakes. Let's stop it. Let's nip it in the bud, because I don't even want the possibility, the potential for this to cause harm on my bottom line. And these people who were accusing the Jews of that knew this. They didn't really have strong evidence, but just the mere fact that they could accuse them of potentially doing that, it was enough for someone who had a lot of resources and a lot to lose. And it continues. Verse 14. Now because we received support from the palace, it was not proper for us to see the king's dishonor. So not only are they relying upon finances, but now they are relying upon ego, which is another great way to manipulate anyone, especially someone as high-ranking as a king, right? We don't want you to lose your honor. We don't want you to lose your status, the respect and the dignity that is owed to you. That will be hindered if you allow these people to thrive. 15. That search may be made in the book of the records of your fathers, and you will find in the book of the records, and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces, and that they have incited sedition, in other words, going against the government, within the city in former times, for which cause this city was destroyed. We inform the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, the result will be that you will have no dominion beyond the river. So they touched upon different aspects of this king's ego, this king's resources, the power and the influence that he had. And they raised enough worry to the point where the king did investigate. So he went ahead and looked through the records and found possible reasons to doubt that the people of God should continue to work. He found elements in their history that suggested that it would be worrisome and problematic for them to continue. Now, bear in mind, we don't know exactly what he found in these documents, but it is likely that if you're already having these types of assumptions and thoughts that the people of God are deviant, are evil by nature, are self-serving, are egotistical, have bias. Do those things sound familiar? Any of those things ring a bell? Then no matter what you do or what you say, people will find reasons to doubt what you're doing and why you are doing it. If people already have their mindset that you are a type of person just based on who you are regarding your faith and your belief in God, it doesn't matter what you do or what you say and how you live your life. People will find reasons to believe that you are deviant, that you are selfish, that you don't have a clue about reality, and whatever you do and whatever you say fits into those negative categories, regardless if it is true or if it is not true. And this is what was occurring. his mind was already made. And now it was just a matter of finding evidence to fulfill the thought process that was already established. So we finally have a ruling. We finally have what occurred based on, this exchanges. We'll pick it up on verse 18, and it states here, and this is part of the response, right? The letter which you sent to us has been clearly read before me, and I gave the command, and a search has been made, and it was found that the city in former times has revolted against kings, and rebellion and sedition have been fostered in it. There have also been mighty kings over Jerusalem who have ruled over all the region beyond the river, and tax, tribute, and customs were paid to them. Now give the command to make these men cease, that the city may not be built until the command is given by me. Take heed now that you do not fail to do this. Why should damage increase to the hurt of the kings? So he said, okay, found evidence, now let's stop the work. Once these enemies received this response, verse 23 states that they right away went to the Jews and informed them of the king's decree. And as a consequence of that, they had to stop working. They had to cease what they were doing, and this happened over a period of many, many years. So throughout the whole building process, whether we're talking about the initial stages, whether we're talking about when they were actually building the temple, or when they were ready to build the walls, these things would occur to the point where they had to stop working. And then, as I mentioned on verse 24, now the story goes back to where it left off on verse 5, and it says, thus the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, ceased, and it was discontinued until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So this King Darius, he basically was the major king after King Cyrus. There were other rulers in between, but they were not very significant, and they didn't reign for a very long time. But the next one over, in that period of time, after a period of stoppage of work, then they continue, but then later on they would stop again and continue, stop again, so on and so forth, rinse and repeat. So here we have this topic, this theme. And if we were to summarize this topic, it has to do with delays. It has to do with setbacks. Again, in the beginning of the story, the first 3 chapters, it was all very positive. Group of people were selected or chose to go back to their homeland, and they had all of these resources, and they traveled, a long time to finally arrive there. And then they started the process seemingly right away, and everything was going fairly well. But then we have accounts of delays. We have accounts of hiccups. We have accounts of setbacks. And this is very much normal in life. Much like it is normal to have great periods of time in your life that is rather boring, as I mentioned in the beginning, setbacks and delays are very much essential, almost, parts of life. We tend to think that delays equals defeats. But in actuality, it's not. Because we have over and over and over again God not only allowing, but using delays for the purposes of the fulfillment of His will. For example, we have the story of Joseph of Egypt. Remember the delays of his life? sold into slavery. It seemed like every single time that he was, getting ahead of the game, he would be tripped up and then fall back. Eventually, accused of wrongdoing against Potiphar's wife, so on and so forth. Delays, setbacks, hiccups. What about David? David anointed king, but for a rather large period of time, over a decade, even though he was technically already anointed as king, he was running for his life. Setbacks, delays, hiccups. What about the story of Moses, the prince of Egypt? For 40 years. And then what happened in the next 40 years? Roaming the desert, a shepherd. Nothing going on. Delays, setbacks, hiccups. What about Abraham and Sarah? Already, relatively up there in age. Didn't have a child or children of their own. God promised that they would, and through that lineage, they would become a great nation. Delays. Seemingly was not happening for a very long time. And you may say, well, that's fine and dandy. Do you ever say that, fine and dandy? I do it all the time. But all of these stories, not only the story that we read here on chapter 4, but all of these other stories regarding Joseph, regarding David, regarding Moses, regarding Abraham and Sarah, and many other stories that I could cite, all of these delays, all of this opposition, all of these setbacks, they were caused by enemies. They were caused by, other people, other entities that were attacking someone or something. But in my life, and this is you saying this, in my life, oftentimes the delays and the setbacks that I experience, the hiccups of life, if you will, they are due to bad decisions. They are self-inflicted wounds. So then in those times, it is definitely time wasted, right? I could see when something happens out of your control, you are doing everything right, and you still experience these setbacks, that maybe God has a plan for those times. But when I sometimes do things that are wrong, less than ideal, and again, these are fruits of my decisions, then definitely that's wasted time. I should have known better, and now, again, there's nothing that God can ever do to utilize that lost time for His purposes. And my response to that is baloney. Joseph. Remember how he was? A brat. Tattletale. Had a dream, couldn't keep it to himself. Had to rub it in. He knew he was his father's favorite. And he loved boasting about that. He loved declaring it to the world, especially to his older brothers. At least partially self-inflicted wound. What about David? Now, David, we can't say anything because he was perfect, right? All of the delays and all of the setbacks that happened in his life, because after all, he was a man after God's own heart. Baloney. David was a liar. David was a deceiver. David was a murderer, among many other things. Self-inflicted wounds. How about Moses? Murderer. The reason why he escaped, he had to leave to the desert, was because he murdered someone. What about Abraham and Sarah? Doubt. Taking matters into their own hands. Questioning the integrity of God's promises and essentially saying, okay, you promised, you didn't fulfill your promise, so I will step in and fulfill it for you. Do you see the trend? Yet God still used those delays and those setbacks for his purpose. And it's almost like God does that intentionally, because for whatever reason, we need, throughout the course of our lives and history, we need these times that God is almost using to redirect us, recalibrate us, refine us. So he pauses. He pauses the progress, and it almost seems like for a while we are actually going backwards, but that's all still part of God's plans. And because it is still part of God's plans, we should not give up, give in, or think it is purposeless, meaningless. We should welcome it as an opportunity for God to elevate his purposes in us, even when we see no progress whatsoever. God is the almighty, sovereign controller of all things, including time. And to God, there is no wasted time. Amen.